In December 1944, the German army that gathered in the Eifel Mountains for the Ardennes offensive was a mix of raw recruits and hardened veterans. The veterans, the NCOs and officers, had survived the Eastern Front. They had lived through the Russian winters of 1941 and 1942. They believed they knew everything there was to know about cold. They looked at the American troops across the line with a distinct sense of superiority. To the Prussian eye, a soldier should look sharp. He should wear a tailored tunic, a stiff collar, and tall leather jackboots. The German uniform was designed for the parade ground as much as the battlefield. It projected power and discipline. When they saw the American GIs, they scoffed. The Americans looked like sacks of potatoes. Their uniforms were baggy. They wore short jackets instead of long coats. They wore rubber boots that looked like something a farmer would wear to muck out a barn. German intelligence reports mocked the American appearance. The enemy is undisciplined and sloppy, the reports read. Their equipment is non-standard. They lack the martial bearing of a true soldier. The German officers believed that this sloppiness reflected a lack of toughness. They believed that the Americans, coming from a land of central heating and cars, would crumple when the temperature dropped. They trusted in their heavy wool greatcoats, the mantle. It was a garment steeped in tradition. It had kept German soldiers warm since the days of Frederick the Great. They believed that wool was the only material that mattered. They didn't realize that they were about to fight a war against a new enemy, the weather. And they didn't realize that the sloppy Americans hadn't designed their uniforms for parades. They had designed them in a laboratory. The Germans were bringing tradition to a fight against thermodynamics. The United States Army Quartermaster Corps had approached the problem of winter warfare with scientific ruthlessness. They realized that a single heavy coat, like the German greatcoat, was a trap. If you marched in it, you sweated. When you stopped, the sweat froze, and you died. So, they invented the layering system. It was a radical departure from military tradition. Instead of one big garment, the GI wore multiple thin ones. The base was a wool undershirt. Then a wool flannel shirt. Then a high-neck sweater. Then, and this was the key, the M1943 field jacket. It was made of windproof, water-resistant cotton sateen. It didn't provide warmth itself, it provided a shield. Underneath it, the soldier could button in a pile liner, a jacket made of synthetic fur or alpaca wool. This system trapped layers of dead air. Air is the best insulator. It allowed the soldier to regulate his temperature. If he was marching and getting hot, he took off the liner. If he was sitting in a foxhole, he put it back on. The Germans laughed at the short jacket. They thought it left the legs exposed. But the Americans had separate wool trousers and windproof over trousers to match. The sloppy look was actually a function of the loose fit required to trap air. Tight clothes make you cold because they compress the insulation and cut off circulation. The American uniform was baggy by design. While the German soldier was locked inside his heavy, restrictive wool coat, unable to adjust to the changing exertion levels of combat, the American GI was wearing a personal climate control system. It was ugly. It was UN military. But it was a masterpiece of survival engineering. The most critical battle of the winter wasn't fought with guns, it was fought with boots. The German jackboot, Marschstiefel, was legendary. Tall, black leather. But it had a fatal flaw: hobnails. The soles were studded with steel nails for grip. In sub-zero temperatures, steel acts as a thermal bridge. It sucks the heat out of the foot and conducts the cold of the frozen ground right through the sole. Also, the boots were tight. They restricted blood flow. The result was massive frostbite. The Americans had a different solution: the shoe pack, ME 1944. It was a hybrid boot. The bottom was rubber. The top was leather. It looked clumsy. It looked like a duck hunting boot. But the rubber bottom was waterproof. In the freezing slush of the Ardennes, this was vital. Inside the boot, the GI wore 2 pairs of socks and a thick felt insole. The rubber didn't conduct cold like the steel hobnails. The shoe pack had problems: it didn't breathe well, leading to sweaty feet and trench foot if socks weren't changed, but it prevented the catastrophic frozen foot that decimated the German ranks. Later in the battle, the Americans introduced the Mickey Mouse boot, overshoes. The Germans mocked the Americans for wearing galoshes. They are afraid to get their feet wet, the Germans joked. They didn't understand that wet feet in December meant amputation. The German obsession with the warrior aesthetic of the leather boot blinded them to the reality of the environment. They were marching on ice with steel soles. The Americans were walking on rubber and felt. The Germans looked like soldiers. The Americans looked like hunters. And in the forest, the hunter wins. When the full winter kit was issued, the American soldier transformed. He put on his long johns, his wool shirt, his sweater, his pile liner, his field jacket, his scarf, his wool cap worn under the steel helmet, his double-buckled boots or shoe packs, his gloves with wool inserts. He looked puffed up, round. The troops called themselves Michelin men. They waddled. They grumbled that they couldn't move their arms. It was the antithesis of the sleek, sharp silhouette of the Prussian soldier. German snipers noted that American soldiers looked fat and slow. But this bulk was armor against the elements. When the temperature in the Ardennes dropped to 0, the fat soldiers stayed warm. The air trapped in their baggy clothes kept their core temperature up. They could function. They could pull triggers. They could load shells. The German soldiers, looking sharp in their tailored coats, began to freeze. Their bodies shunted blood away from their fingers to keep their core warm. They lost dexterity. They fumbled with their weapons. Their military bearing became a shivering crouch. The American Michelin man might have looked ridiculous, but he was still an effective fighting unit. The Germans underestimated the value of comfort. They believed that suffering ennobled the soldier. The Americans believed that suffering distracted the soldier. By removing the distraction of the cold, the U.S. Army ensured that its men could focus on the only thing that mattered: killing the enemy. The ugly American in his baggy coat was about to prove that he could outlast the freezing cold that was killing the master race. On December 16, 1944, the German offensive began in fog and damp cold. It was miserable, but manageable. Then, around Christmas, the skies cleared. A high-pressure system from Siberia moved in. The temperature plummeted. It hit 0 degrees Fahrenheit, -18 Celsius. At night, with the wind chill, it felt like -20 or -30. This was the 0-degree shock. It was a test that the German army failed, and the American army passed, barely. In the foxholes of the 101st Airborne at Bastogne, or the 2nd Division at Elsenborn Ridge, the Americans were shivering. They were miserable. Their feet hurt. Their faces were raw. But they weren't dying of hypothermia. The layering system was working. A soldier on sentry duty at 2 a.m. would wear everything he owned, his pile liner, his sweater, his jacket, a blanket wrapped around his shoulders. The trapped air kept him alive. On the other side of the lines, the German army was in crisis. German casualty reports from this period are horrifying. Thousands of men were evacuated not with bullet wounds, but with severe frostbite. Whole companies were rendered combat ineffective because the men could not hold their rifles with frozen fingers. German officers, the veterans who had mocked the Americans, found their own men freezing to death in the same woods. The difference was the equipment. The Germans had planned for a quick breakthrough. They had brought enough fuel and ammo for a week, but they hadn't brought enough winter clothing for a siege. They were fighting in their summer uniforms with only a greatcoat over the top. The Americans, even in their haste to deploy, had been issued the basics of the winter kit. It was a logistical triumph that translated into tactical survival. The Germans had hoped General Winter would be their ally. Instead, he was an impartial killer, and the Americans were better armored against him. There are two kinds of cold: dry cold and wet cold. Dry cold, like in Russia, is dangerous, but manageable if you stay dry. Wet cold, like in the Ardennes, is insidious. The temperature hovers around freezing, 32 degrees Fahrenheit, 0 degrees Celsius. It rains during the day and freezes at night. There is wet snow and slush. Everything gets damp. This is where the German wool greatcoat failed spectacularly. Wool is warm when dry. But wool sponges up water. A German soldier walking through wet snow would find the hem of his long coat getting soaked. The moisture would wick up the fabric. The coat would become incredibly heavy. And a wet coat is not an insulator. It is a heat sink. It pulls heat away from the body to evaporate the water. The German soldiers were walking around in heavy, wet blankets that were slowly killing them. The American M1943 jacket was made of tightly woven cotton poplin or sateen. It was treated with a water-repellent finish. When it rained or snowed, the moisture beaded up and rolled off. It wasn't perfectly waterproof. If you sat in a puddle, you got wet, but it shed the environmental moisture that was soaking the Germans. The American soldier was damp, but the German soldier was soaked. The difference in morale was immense. A soldier who is constantly wet and cold loses the will to fight. He becomes apathetic. The Americans grumbled, but they stayed combat effective. Their gear allowed them to exist in the wet-cold environment without succumbing to it. The Germans had built their equipment for the steppes, the Americans had built theirs for the swamp. The Ardennes campaign was almost lost not to German bullets, but to a fungus. Trench foot, immersion foot. It happens when feet are cold and wet for prolonged periods. The blood vessels constrict. The tissue begins to die. The foot turns white, then red, then black. Gangrene sets in. It is agonizingly painful. Both armies suffered terribly from it. The American Army had over 70,000 cold injury cases in the winter of 1944–45. The shoe-pack boot was a double-edged sword. Its rubber bottom was waterproof, keeping external water out. But rubber doesn't breathe. A soldier's foot sweats. That sweat stays inside the rubber boot. The American command realized the danger. They ordered a rigorous regimen of foot care. Every day, soldiers were supposed to take off their boots, dry their feet, and put on dry socks. They were supposed to massage each other's feet to restore circulation. It was hard discipline to maintain in a foxhole under mortar fire. But where it was enforced, it worked. The Germans had no such system. Their tight leather jackboots constricted blood flow, the worst possible thing for trench foot. Once a German soldier's feet got wet, and they always did, his boots were impossible to dry out in the field. Leather takes days to dry. So they kept their wet boots on. German field hospitals were overwhelmed with amputation cases. The Americans fought the trench foot epidemic with logistics, shipping millions of pairs of spare socks to the front, and with discipline. The Germans had neither. They had mocked the rubber boots, but those boots, combined with sock changes, kept the American infantry walking when the German infantry was crippled. The image of the German soldier in his long field grey greatcoat is iconic. But in the dynamic, mobile battles of the Ardennes, it was a liability. It was designed for static trench warfare or marching on roads. In the dense forests of the Ardennes, soldiers had to crawl, climb over deadfall, and sprint from cover to cover. The long coat tangled in their legs. It snagged on branches. When it got wet and heavy with mud and snow, it was like wearing a lead anchor. German infantry attacking up snowy slopes were exhausted before they even reached the American lines. They couldn't move fast enough to dodge fire. The American M1943 jacket was short. It ended at the hips. It allowed complete freedom of movement. An American GI could run, jump, and crawl without hindrance. The Germans realized their mistake too late. They started issuing shorter parkas-style jackets to elite units, like the SS, but there weren't enough of them. The vast majority of the Wehrmacht was stuck in a garment that belonged in the 19th century. The greatcoat was a symbol of the rigidity of German thinking. They were wedded to a form that no longer matched the function of modern warfare. The Americans, with no tradition to hold them back, had adopted a practical, athletic design. In the deep snow, that sloppy American jacket was a racing suit compared to the German straitjacket. By January 1945, the arrogance of the German officer corps had evaporated in the freezing winds of the Ardennes. The average German soldier, the Lanzer, was freezing, wet, and miserable. And he began to notice something about the dead Americans he encountered. They were wearing better clothes. A grim new dynamic emerged on the battlefield. When a German unit overran an American position, they didn't just look for ammunition or food. They stripped the bodies. The biggest prize was the boots. German soldiers would discard their frozen, tight leather jackboots and put on the clumsy-looking American rubber-bottomed shoepacks or Arctic overshoes. Next came the field jackets and the pile liners. It became common to see German infantrymen fighting in a bizarre mix of field grey uniforms and olive-drab American jackets. This was the ultimate admission of defeat. The soldiers of the self-proclaimed master race, fighting for the glorious Third Reich, were forced to wear the cast-off clothing of their degenerate enemy just to survive the winter. It was a humiliation that stung deeper than any propaganda defeat. The German officers tried to stop it. It was bad for morale. It caused confusion in combat. Soldiers hesitated to shoot at silhouettes wearing German helmets but American jackets. But the instinct for survival overrode discipline. The German soldier knew what his commanders refused to admit: the Americans had won the supply war. The war didn't stop when the sun went down. The temperatures dropped even further, often plunging to -10 degrees Fahrenheit, -23 degrees Celsius. Sleep became a life-or-death struggle. A soldier who cannot sleep eventually collapses from exhaustion. Here, the technological gap was immense. The American soldier was issued the mountain sleeping bag. It was filled with a mix of down and feathers. It was designed like a mummy case to trap maximum heat. A GI could crawl into that bag in a snowbank, zip it up tight, and sleep warm even in sub-zero temperatures. It was a sanctuary. The German soldier had a wool blanket. Perhaps he had a Zeltbahn, a triangular piece of canvas that could be used as a poncho or buttoned together with others to make a drafty tent. At night, the Germans huddled together in groups of 3 or 4, sharing body heat under thin blankets, shivering violently. They never truly rested. They started each new day already exhausted, their calorie reserves depleted by the effort of just staying warm. The Americans woke up stiff, but rested. This cumulative difference in sleep deprivation had a massive impact on combat effectiveness. That sleeping bag miracle meant that the American army could sustain high-intensity operations for weeks, while the German army slowly ground to a halt from sheer physical exhaustion. Why was the German gear so bad by 1944? It wasn't just poor design, it was industrial collapse. The Allied naval blockade had strangled Germany of raw materials. They had no access to cotton. Their wool supplies were dwindling. The German textile industry was forced to rely on ersatz, substitute, materials. They used shoddy wool, old rags and uniforms that were shredded and respun into new fabric. It was rough, itchy, and lacked the insulating properties of virgin wool. More disastrously, they relied on rayon, a synthetic fiber made from wood cellulose. Late-war German uniforms contained high percentages of rayon. It looked okay when dry. But when wood cellulose gets wet, it loses its structural integrity. When a German soldier crawled through wet snow, his uniform absorbed water like a paper towel. It became incredibly heavy. And if it snagged on barbed wire or a branch, it tore easily. German uniforms were literally disintegrating off their backs under combat conditions. The Americans had access to unlimited supplies of high-quality, long-staple cotton. Their sateen jackets were tough, durable, and resistant to tearing. The battle of materials was being fought on the back of every soldier. The American gear held together, the German gear fell apart. By the end of January 1945, the Bulge had been flattened. The German offensive was a catastrophic failure. As the sun came out over the ruined landscape, it illuminated a new reality. Columns of dejected German prisoners marched into captivity. They were freezing, many limping on gangrenous feet, wrapped in tattered blankets and sodden wool greatcoats. The Prussian warrior aesthetic was gone, replaced by misery. Guarding them stood the American GI. He looked terrible. He was unshaven. He was covered in mud. He was wearing 3 layers of baggy, mismatched green clothes. He waddled in his oversized rubber boots. He looked, as the Germans had said, like a sack of potatoes. But he was warm. He had 10 toes. And he was the victor. The Battle of the Bulge proved that in modern, industrialized warfare, aesthetics are meaningless. The Germans had clung to a tradition of military fashion that looked powerful on a parade ground but failed in the forest. The Americans, unburdened by tradition, had embraced a philosophy of pure function. They didn't care what their soldiers looked like, they cared what their soldiers could do. That sloppy's American uniform system was actually the most technologically advanced survival suit ever issued to an army up to that point. It was a triumph of American pragmatism. The best-dressed army didn't win the war. The best-equipped army did.